Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Trust you're having a good day. You're welcome to our quarterly economic review series. My name is Aderoju Akimbo, and I welcome you all to this series. Before we dive right into it, apologies for starting a little bit late. So before we dive right into it, I would like to say that should you have any questions or answers or suggestion, kindly make use of the question and answer box. We would not be taking any questions that is not stated in the question and answer box, please. So thank you for that. So while we start, amidst the ongoing tension globally as a result of the Ukraine-Russian war, we continue to see increase in commodity prices, inflation, which affects cost of living and operating cost of businesses. Locally, internal issues persist as evident at the economy level, such as low cost of crude oil production, inflation at 20.52%, NPR rates at NPR at 15.5%, among other political and insecurity challenges. It has become pertinent and critical to know what to expect, especially in the aspect of investment. I'd like to welcome our delectable speaker, a seasoned media commentator on global and economic issues with 30 years spanning experience in the banking and investment operations, a facilitator with ICANN and FITC, the founder and the group managing director of Kawi Asset Management Group, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, FCA.
Thank you, everyone. I don't know whether you can hear me. I guess you can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon. We can hear you.
Okay. I will try and share my presentation slide. Just a second. Joseph, you can unshare so that I'll share it, so that it's easy for the flow. Joseph, you can unshare. Okay, good.
Okay, that's it.
Why did it just come up now?
So, see.
I don't know if you can see my slide now.
Yes, sir.
Yes, please, we
can see your slide.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And just like my colleague has welcomed all of us, it's always a pleasure to welcome us to this our quarterly economic report card, our economic review. So we'll be discussing how the economy has fared, global economy has fared in the third quarter of this year. And we'll also try to hazard a guess on what will happen in the sectors of the economy. Once again, please accept apologies for starting a few minutes late. So we'll try to cover the time so that you wouldn't lose the time you have waited for us to start. Okay, so I'll start by talking about the summary of the global economy. Of course, we, just like my colleague said, the global economy has seen some challenges since the beginning of this year. For instance, China's economy has slowed down as a result of zero COVID policy adopted, which has stifled output in key production centers in China. We've seen as a result of protracted war in Ukraine, higher energy costs have had negative impact on European economies. Not just European economies, have also affected other economies and other parts of the world, including Nigeria. We've seen the Ukraine war is expected to cost the world about $2.8 trillion. We know that the US and Western countries have been pumping a lot of resources to Ukraine to support the war effort. Central banks are across the world, as a result of the current inflationary pressure, have been raising interest rates at unprecedented rates. We've also seen central banks intervene in the currencies, the local currencies, like what happened in the UK. The UK government there was a change in government in UK, and we had a sudden, unexpected cut in personal income tax, which the market reacted negatively to. It led to a drop in the British pound sterling to the lowest in its history, where the British pound dropped to about $1 to $1.02 to a British pound. Of course, the government has revised that policy, and we've seen the British pound begin to recover. So before I leave that aspect, I want to mention to us that we expect that with aggressive tightening of monetary policies, accelerating inflation, forex scarcity, worsening debt position, persistent insecurity, decline in capital importation, we expect that a weaker GDP growth rate in Q4 2022. Recall that GDP grew at 3.54% in Q2 2022 and grew by 3.11% in Q1 2022. So we think that will taper in the current quarter. Now let's look at what is driving global momentum, which has been undermined. We've seen that growth in three major sectors of the three largest economies in the world, the United States, China, and Europe, have actually weakened in the current year. If you look at that graph, you will see the weakening of Q2 performance of the GDPs compared to where they were in the preceding quarter and the preceding year. If you look at the US GDP grew about almost 4%, about 3.7%, in 3.8% in 2020, and then say Q2 2020, and only grew by just about less than 2% in Q2 2022. So you can see that virtually all the economies, the major economies, are hurting. Of course, we've seen rising government borrowing costs and large capital outflows, which is worsening the balance of payment position of most developing countries. We've seen flight to safety of investors going back to advanced economies. So against this backdrop, the World Bank is forecasting that the GDP, world GDP will grow by 2.9% in 2022 and 2.2% in 2023. Then I think I have to bring this to this point, that one of the pressures the world is witnessing is the war. Of course, a lot of things we're discussing today are as a result of the fallout of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And at some point, Ukraine allowed Russia to export food items from the Black Sea port. And that has led to moderation in food prices across the globe. So it was expecting that, and they've also done an exchange of prisoners. So it was expected that this war may be moving towards its end. Unfortunately, only on 30th, which was on Friday, 30th of September, Russia announced the annexation of 4 Ukrainian oblasts. And that will mean that, because both Ukraine and the Western countries have said they will never recognize that annexation. Russia took over or carried out what they call the sham referendum in Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and to for people to elect whether they wanted to be part of Russia, and they have now brought them in as part of the Russian Republic. So the challenge with that is that with this, it looks like the war will not end soon unless Russia will reverse that position. Of course, that will now require a lot of face saving because it might be difficult for Russia to reverse that position. And then, as if that was not enough, global tension was further heightened in August as US and China squabbled over Taiwan. The US, as part of her strategy to deter China from following the example of Russia to invade Taiwan, sent the US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to visit Taiwan on the 2nd of August, despite protests by China and a threat that her military would not sit idly by if Pelosi visits Taiwan. In fact, it was speculated that one propagandist said that China was going to shoot down a Pelosi plane if it tried to come into Taiwan. Of course, we know that Pelosi had to be escorted by US fighters to Taiwan. But that didn't take place because if that had happened, of course, we would have today be talking about a third world war. Well, the key thing that we must know is that Pelosi is the highest ranking US official to visit Taiwan, which further is a further proof that that action to visit Taiwan by a higher ranking US official is a measure to send a message to China that we're not going to sit idly by and watch you invade Taiwan just because Russia has invaded Ukraine. We know that the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson resigned his post as a Conservative Party amid scandals. There have been several scandals around the guy, including the issue of organizing and hosting a party during the COVID lockdown. We saw a full-scale resignation of his cabinet members, which led to his final resignation. So the UK Parliament elected Elizabeth Truss to lead the US government. Unfortunately, she started badly, and the first thing she did was, the first economic announcement she did was to cut taxes by about 45 billion pounds. Of course, the market reacted negatively to that, and the pound sterling reached its lowest level in history, and traded at $1.02 to a pound. But she reversed that decision about 2 days ago. We all know that the London Bridge fell in the month of September, on September 8th. I'm sure many of us in this meeting would have read or listened to videos of what Britain would do if the Queen of England died. And it was supposed to be announced that the London Bridge had fallen. So London Bridge eventually fell on 8th of September 2022. The Queen was buried on 19th of September. The UK government declared a bank holiday to commemorate her burial, meaning that the UK has had 2 more public holidays this year than it had projected. The impact of this, for those of us in Nigeria and some other developing countries that easily declare public holidays, that the impact of this will be a 0.2% negative impact, negative growth on the UK GDP in September, just because it had declared a public holiday to celebrate the burial of the Queen of England. Then we've also seen another calamity in America. We saw Hurricane Ian made the landfall in Florida and North Carolina on September 30th, leaving at least 109 people dead. As at yesterday, the number of dead bodies that have been retrieved as at yesterday was about 109. 105 of that, 55 of that was from Florida. So we've seen, of course, we know Florida, Cuba, North Carolina, Georgia, some of these US states are prone to hurricane. If you recall the Katrina impact on Florida a couple of years back. So the impact on Cuba was to the extent that there was a blackout that left about 50,000 people without light. As at yesterday, there were out 2.2 million people in Florida and North Carolina that had not gotten light restored. The impact of this is that the state of Nevada, the state of Florida is likely going to suffer between 45 and $55 billion in losses as a result of the Hurricane Ian. And this is supposed to have a negative impact of about 2 to 3% contraction on US GDP in the third quarter of this year. Headline inflation is projected to peak in Q3 2022 in most economies and begin to decline by Q4 2022. The basic thing that it would drive down inflation from Q4 2022 is because we've seen, like I mentioned earlier, a lifting of the restriction on food exports from Ukraine and Russia. And we know that both countries are considered the food basket of the world. So we've seen moderation in food prices across the globe as a result of the lifting of that restriction, as a result of the export of food to the Black Sea port. And so we are beginning to see a moderation in inflation rate across the world. And then there was also an easing in the price of crude oil. Yesterday was Brent crude traded about $88, moved back to $89. But interestingly, as a result of the concerns expressed by most economic analysts that the world is being pushed into a recession as a result of, due to the contraction of monetary policy across the globe, oil prices began to trend southwards, and OPEC and OPEC Plus members have decided to meet to review and possibly reduce crude production. And they had actually started mentioning that they will reduce crude production by about 1 million barrels a day, only for them to say yesterday that they will now want to reduce the crude production by about 2 million barrels. And as of this morning, Brent crude price have gone up again. Brent crude is trading at more than $90 per barrel in reaction or in response to the expectation that OPEC Plus will reduce crude production by about 2 million barrels. Of course, we know the US was the first country to begin tightening our monetary policies, and the other countries had to follow suit. Simple reason why other countries had to follow suit is because if US tightens, there will be flow of capital away from most economies back to US, and other countries have to protect their currency by also tightening to reduce the outflow of funds or investments to US. We all know that the US has the highest credit-driven consumer market in the world. What that means is that monetary policy tools are very effective because the transmission channel is very robust. And let me explain this further. The basic thing that happens is that when you tighten monetary policies or increase interest rates, it becomes difficult, it becomes expensive for people to borrow to consume. And US economies and economy people live on what they call credit cards or credits. People borrow for their next 6 months of income and begin to consume. So when you increase interest rates, they can no longer afford to continue to borrow, and therefore that slows down consumption in an economy like the US. And that's why for US, the increase in monetary policy rates had two effects. One, it led to flow of capital back to the US, and two, it moderated consumer spending, and that has led to some level of gradual restoration of equilibrium between demand and supply. So if you look at this, you will observe that the highest inflation rate in US was a 9.1% in July. And that figure was about 40 years high compared to what they have recorded in the last 40 years. But it has begun to moderate. In July, it came down to 8.5% and came down further to 8.3% in August. Like I had mentioned to us earlier, the US has the most robust transmission channel for managing inflation rate in the world because of the huge consumer credit-driven consumption in that country. But let me also establish a nexus between inflation and unemployment. You know, basic thing that happens that when the monetary policy authorities increase inflation rate, interest rates, what they want to do is cool down the economy. Cooling down the economy, like I said, it simply means that they want to reduce demand. And for an economy that has a robust and well-developed consumer credit market, what will happen is that when you increase interest rates, consumers can no longer afford to borrow as much as they were using to buy now, and that will lead to a reduction in demand for goods and services. The reduction in goods and services will lead to a reduction in production. The reduction in production will lead to a reduction in employment. And resulting in employment simply means you have a higher level of unemployment. And that's why if you look at the slide here, you will observe that the US unemployment rate fell to an all-time high of 3.5% in July. But by August, it had reversed. As inflation rate began to come down, as you saw, you also observe that unemployment rate is ticking up, because what will happen in our companies will now slow down on their production and therefore slow down on the number of people they keep in their employment. And that's so the World Central Bank, which is why the IMF is warning that if we continue in this trend of tightening monetary policies, you're going to end up pushing the world to a recession, because production will slow down, and if production slows down, employment will slow down. When employment slows down, consumption will slow down further. And then it's a cycle. The cycle will repeat itself. As consumption slow down further, production will slow down further, production will slow down further, employment will slow down further, and on to stimulate the economy again. I had talked about briefly on the UK economy. The UK economy saw one of also highest inflation rates in July at 10.1%. We've also seen a moderation to 9.9% in August. But the Bank of England is still projecting that inflation will go up. In fact, this projection would actually have been worse if Elizabeth Truss had stuck to her policy of reducing taxes, because that would have created so much of funding deficit that the government would have borrowed heavily. And that borrowing would have meant injection of liquidity into an economy that was not producing. So the UK is also going through its own difficulties in terms of price levels, of course, driven by prices of food and prices of petroleum products. The energy cost, I had mentioned the price of petroleum products. Energy cost is one of the major drivers of course, petroleum products are part of energy costs. One of the major drivers of inflation where the UK is witnessing. Part of the cut they wanted to do, they also planned to give out some level of subsidy for energy consumption in the UK. If you look at the slide here, you will observe that in October, instead of paying a maximum of 28 penny per kilowatt hour of electricity, they now pay 34 pence. And then instead of paying 7 pence per kilowatt hour for gas, they now pay 10.3 pence. And that is hurting households in UK. Then moving on to China. China seemed to have sidestepped the health impact of COVID-19 in the early days of the pandemic due to its zero COVID policy. This Asian powerhouse was the world's only major economy to record expansion in 2020 and went on to grow at 8% in 2021. However, as the same zero tolerance for COVID or zero tolerance policy has begun to come back to hurt China, because it has continued to lock down when most countries have developed communal immunity or herd immunity, and most countries have opened up fully in the economies while China is still locking down. So that lockdown, and as well as the crash in its real estate markets, has had a negative impact in China to the extent that the Chinese economy is expected to grow by only 3.2% in 2022 compared to a growth of 8% in 2021. The Eurozone is not left out Eurozone is actually one of the transmitters of the current economic crisis. Of course, we know Europe depends on 40% of its gas consumption from Russian gas feed. And you know that the Nord pipeline has been shut as a result of leakage, as also being used as a political economic tool to fight the war. So the Europe inflation actually hit the height of 9.1% in August. You can see the trend in Europe is still continuing. But good thing is that we've seen food prices begin to moderate. And we're hoping that the impact of the food prices will help stabilize, begin to bring down the inflation rate in Europe. But Europe is determined to weather through the war, irrespective of what happens. The Canadian inflation rate is going in the direction of the US. Canada is also largely economically, it's almost an appendage of the US. So you realize that economic policies in US have direct impact on the Canadian economy. This is just to show us the projections of global growth across different economies. This is just to show also that virtually all the economies in the world are expected to slow down in the current year as their projections have been revised. I just move forward on this so that I had mentioned the fact that Europe largely depend on Russia for supply of gas, and it has not fully found a substitute to that. I know the Western countries have also come up with, they're going to set a price cap for crude oil import from Russia in December, and also set a price cap for gas in February. But those are difficult to call, given the fact that they've not found substitutes. I've always said it that the swing producer in the world today, which is Saudi Arabia, does not have the capacity to replace the volume of crude that Russia is producing. Russia produces about 10 million barrels a day. Russia is the third largest producer of crude, and just slightly behind Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia does not have capacity to increase its production of about 10 million barrels to 20 million barrels. And as long as that cannot be achieved, and countries like Nigeria are the ones lagging behind, so Russia will continue to impact on the price of crude globally. We've seen the US Federal Reserve Bank has increased rates 5 times in the current year, all in a bid to fight inflation. Of course, the impact of US Federal Reserve Bank increasing interest, as I mentioned earlier, you see flow back of capital into the Western countries, particularly the US, strengthening of the US dollars, more investment flow back to the US, and also on the converse, slowdown in consumer borrowing, slowdown in consumer consumption, slowdown in production, uptick in inflation, in unemployment. So that those things are beginning all manifest in the US. The Bank of England has also, in similar vein, increased rates for 7 straight meetings, from a 50 basis points to current from the last increment was a 50 basis point from 1.75% to 2.25%. Likewise, the European Central Bank has also increased rates, and the Bank of England has increased rates. Nigeria has not been left out. We also know that the MPC at its September meeting increased policy rate from 14% to 15.5% and increased the cash reserve ratio from 27.5% to 32.5%. Interestingly, Russia is one of the countries that are benefiting economically from the war, which they started. Russia has seen a consistent decline in its policy rates, has seen a consistent decline in inflation rates, and for that reason has cut down on its monetary policy rates. Of course, we know that when the Western countries slammed sanctions on Russia, Russia had to, in order to manage its currency, had to increase rates to 20%, hoping that will attract investors to come into the economy. But today, they have consistently dropped rates. You can also see here that the inflation rate in Russia has been moderating. Russia had built the first 3 months of the war. Russia earned $100 billion in revenue from sale of crude. Virtually all crude oil exporting countries have been celebrating or dancing to the banks. But unfortunately, we are not the beneficiary of that because of our contradictions of the country. Interestingly, the developing countries are the ones who are facing the worst of the headwinds as sharp slowdown in global growth raises the risk of prolonged recession in these economies, particularly the developing economies. Issues affecting emerging economies include higher food prices. We've seen a demonstration in Sri Lanka where they drove away their prime president. We've seen that manifest in other countries, including Ghana, our next door neighbors. Unavailability of fertilizer higher, energy prices, rising interest rates, currency depreciation, and capital flow. And I can agree with me, virtually all these that are manifesting in emerging economies are hitting us as a country. But sub-Saharan African countries are supposed to suffer more headwinds because one, they export largely raw materials. There's no beneficiation in most of their exports. Many of them have very precarious fiscal conditions, so they rely on borrowing, and many of them are paying interest. I'm sure you know that the inflation rate in Ghana has gone to 3.9%. And the Monetary Policy Committee in Ghana has increased interest rates to about over 40%, but that has not solved the Ghanaian problem. Although I heard some positive news of Ghana's export of, I think, cocoa, or I think one of the agricultural products to the tune of about $1.2 billion. So that will help moderate the impact. Ghana has also approached the World Bank, the IMF, sorry, for budgetary support. The impact of the US and other Western economies increasing rates cannot be overemphasized. And that's why the United Nations has warned, I think, including IMF, that the US has to cut down on the rate at which increasing interest rates, otherwise it could push other economies into a recession. This is just to show us the fact that several emerging economies are hurting, and that you can see clearly that the countries like Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Venezuela, Zambia have all declared debt moratorium on their debt payments, and that consequently have been furthered on their Eurobond payments. There are concerns that countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Pakistan, and Egypt could also follow in defaulting on our debt, Eurobond, foreign currency debt instruments. Ghana is particularly in a precarious situation. Nigeria's situation may not be about a Ghanaian situation, but if you look at the fact that most of these countries, their FX reserve as a cover of their import we have all declined in the recent past. You see a foreign reserve of Egypt had dropped by about 26%, Pakistan by 33%, Ghana by 29%, although Nigeria's case has been managed just 5%. But the 5% may not say the whole story, because we have unmet and claims, including the claim by the airlines that their tickets sales are not really limited. Of course, our economy grew by 3.54% in the second quarter of this year. That was an improvement from a 3.11% recorded, 3.1% recorded in the first quarter of this year. The GDP growth was slightly driven by the non-oil sector. The oil sector, interestingly, has continued to contract. If you look at the figures that was announced by the NBS, the oil sector now accounts for just about 6.33% of the GDP. Nigeria, I had mentioned that it has not benefited from the crude oil, the price oil windfall that other countries have enjoyed. And unfortunately, we have rather suffered the negative impact that countries that are major oil importing countries have suffered. Then you've seen our inflation rate increase to 20.52% in the year, up from 17.6% in July, which has led the Central Bank adopting a very hawkish stand. I had mentioned that monetary policy rate have been increased to 15.5% and cash reserve ratio by 2.5%. Subsidy in August, according to Reuters, is about as August was about 2.6 trillion naira the government has spent on subsidy. There are different figures. The figure from the Minister of Finance, we say that we are spending about 874 billion million naira to subsidize petroleum products every day would mean that at the end of this year, we spend about 6.52 trillion naira as subsidy. Of course, we expect social tensions and violence could increase going forward as religious and regional divides as treated by the federal by the national election of February 2023. This is just to give you some level of overview or highlight of what to expect. At the domestic end, we expect high and stable inflation rates. Is expected foreign exchange rates will continue to depreciate in the short term. And then on interest rates, we expect interest rates to go up, given the tightening of liquidity across by the Monetary Policy Committee. In terms of profitability of corporate organizations or corporate earnings, we expect that there will be strained purchasing power, and the rising cost of doing business will depress both the top line and bottom line, although banks may benefit from increase in interest rates. Then on the political scene, we expect that the political activities are going to coming up right now, and that will have some level of dampening effect on the economy. Then let's look at, I'm trying to move a bit faster because of time constraints. Okay, if you look at this is basically to show you the quarter-on-quarter growth in the price in the GDP of the country. The economy is evidently growing at a very soft rate, though you saw a growth of 3.54%, but the challenges we're having are that the energy challenges, power supply challenges, high cost of diesel. Currently at the pump price of diesel is about 800 naira to a liter, and then you've seen the national grid collapse 7 times this year. And then we expect that the insecurity could worsen in the current, as we approach the election year, given the tendency of some political actors to adopt ethnic narratives in their campaign. So these are all supposed to have negative impact on the GDP. Then let's look at the sectorial, what we think will happen in the sectors. Okay, in the first place, you remember that agriculture is the largest contributor to Nigeria's GDP. Agriculture accounted for 23.24% of the GDP in the second quarter of this year. But interestingly, despite all the investment, despite all the efforts of the government to invest in to stimulate agricultural production, agricultural sector only grew by 1.2% in the second quarter of this year, down from 3.16% growth recorded in Q1 2021. Why is this so? Because we're witnessing huge disruption in agricultural activities as a result of heightened level of insecurity, which has also the knock-on effect of that is that we're seeing high food inflation figure of about 23.12% in August, because we're not producing enough food locally to feed the country. And that's why, despite all the intervention, co-borrowers program, commercial agricultural scheme, what have you, this and that, the agricultural sector growth has continued to shrink, only growing by 1.2% in the second quarter of this year. ICT sector have become the beautiful bride in the Nigerian economy. From almost a zero contribution to the GDP, that sector has become the second largest contributor to the GDP and now accounts about 18.44% of the GDP and grew by 6.5% in Q2 2022. The trade sector follows second. Trade sector used to be the second largest contributor to the GDP. With currently, the third largest contributor to the GDP has been pushed down and is still contributing about 16.8% of the GDP. But interestingly, it grew by 4.51% in Q2 2022, down from 6.54% it grew in Q1 2022. This is largely because of difficulties in assessing effects and also lower consumer purchasing power. The manufacturing sector accounts for 8.65% of the Nigerian economy and grew by 3% in the Q2. Oil and gas sector, the one that generates all the revenues in terms of foreign exchange earnings, the one that accounts for about 80% of government revenue, declined by 11.77% in Q2 2022, and now accounts for only 6.3% of the GDP. These are the major drivers of GDP growth rate in Q2 2022. You have a transportation sector. Of course, transportation sector is compared to what was 2020 was a recovery after the COVID crisis. So you have transportation sector grew by 51%. Finance and insurance grew by 18.48%. ICT, we talked about that, grew by 6.55%. Trade 4.5%, we talked about that. Real estate 4.42%. Construction 4%. Manufacturing 3%, we talked about that. Science and technology 1.96%. Education 1.16%. The sector that contracted electricity, gas. Of course, I talked about the fact that we saw a 7 times collapse of the national grid in the past 9 months. We saw that sector contract by 11.48%. The mining and quarry contracted by 11.09%. For you to understand this, because oil and gas is part of the mining and quarry. Remember I said that oil and gas contracted by 11.77%, but that means the mining itself, which is solid minerals, also appreciated or grew slightly, and that's why the overall sector declined by only 11.09%. Okay, I had mentioned earlier that we saw a drop in price of crude in the past few days as a result of concerns that the world economy could be pushed into a recession occasioned due to the current contractionary monetary policies across the world. So Nigeria, unfortunately, is going to be suffering double whammy. We're not producing enough of crude. At the same time, crude price has moderated. Even now that OPEC is projecting to reduce crude production, it is not likely Nigeria will have any benefit from that. If you look at that, the graph, the lower graph, you will see the Nigeria's crude oil production quotas assigned by OPEC. But last month, in the month of August, not last month, we're not in October, crude production by Nigeria was only 972,000 barrels a day, when at the same time we should have been producing 1.83 million barrels a day. We're producing just barely half of what we're supposed to be producing. And therefore, we've not benefited from the disruption of the oil and gas supply occasioned by the Russian-Ukraine war. I guess everybody here know why we're in this situation. Of course, we amount of elaborating the issue to say that we know that crude pipelines have been breached, repeated in the country. Crude is being stolen. I don't know if any of you watched Arise yesterday. You will observe that Arise was showing artisanal crude oil producers. Those are still crude, and many of them said they are graduates, they are unemployed, and they realize that you can make money from stealing crude in their local environment, and they decided to do that. So that's part of the problem we have. We have severe level of unemployment, severe level of poverty, and people within the crude oil producing areas have also not been incentivized enough to have a share of crude production or the benefit of crude production. And that's why we're witnessing the very low crude production in the country. Our reserve, contrary to what's happening in other countries, and for you to understand what's happening in other countries, a country like Angola, which used to be the second largest producer of crude, has seen a reserve grow over that period. Saudi Arabia, you could say, okay, they're a big producer, they produce about 10 million barrels a day. Saudi Arabia has so much accumulated, so much resources in the past the past 8 months, since this was started on February 24th, that Saudi Arabia said they're now going to build a world-class technology-driven digital city that they will even include an artificial moon in that new city they want to build. I had mentioned earlier that Russia in the first 3 months of this war accumulated earnings of $100 billion. And even our next door neighbor, our fellow African country, Angola, has seen an appreciation in its currency from about 522 kwacha per dollar to just about 420 kwacha per dollar as a result of our creation in its reserve. And we've also seen inflation rate drop in Angola from about 27.9%, 27.98% to 19.8% between February when the war started and September this year. But our own is the converse. Our inflation rate has moved from about 15% to 20.52%. And then we are seeing our reserve decline from 40.51 billion to, it was on January 4th, to $38.285 billion. We've also seen that the central bank has been struggling to meet the demand for FX. And then we are seeing queues for those who are importing, stretching into as far back as 2021 on med queues. And I had mentioned earlier that it got ahead that the foreign airlines had to threaten to stop flying into the country. In fact, effectively, Emirates stopped flying into the country. And the federal government or the central bank now saw the wisdom in making payment about, paying them about 50% of their ticket sales. The parallel market exchange rate, of course, once we have pressures in the official market, it then means that investors and those who have need for Forex will go to the parallel market to search for it. We saw a parallel market rate depreciated as low as 735 naira to a dollar. I think as of yesterday, it had touched about 740 naira to a dollar in the parallel market. IE window closed on Thursday at 431 to 0.87 to a dollar, down from about 415.77 to a dollar it opened on 1st of July. The impact of the increase in rates is that the banks are beginning to okay, before we even get to the impact of the increase in rates, you will observe because of the FX scarcity, the banks have actually yanked off any limits. I mean, the little amount you could actually use your Naira card to buy. So Naira card today has become, Naira MasterCard or Visa card, whatever you have become useless for international transactions. At some point, it had reduced it to $20, but now it's zero. Yeah, that will show you, these are all proof of how severe our situation is. Okay, back to the inflation rates. I will talk extensively on this, but one of the things I want to emphasize, which I did in one of my engagements, is that for you to understand how bad the situation in Nigeria has gotten to, if you look at the fact that all item inflation is 20.52%, and food inflation about 23.12%, and you ask yourself, what are those factors that are driving inflation rate in the country? The food inflation is driven largely by the prices of wheat, the prices of tuber like yam, cassava, potato, and other oil, fish. Those are factors driving food inflation in the country. But largely, if you look at tuber, potato, they are all products that are produced locally. If you go to core inflation, which came at a print of 17.2%, the fact is being driven by the likes of fuel, transport costs, fuel, energy costs, transport costs, road transport, air transport increases. And those are pass-through effects of what we call exchange rate depreciation, because part of the problem you have is that when your currency depreciates, importers will have to price their imported products at current exchange rates, and which is one of those factors driving inflation in the country. I think we've talked a lot about this, that food inflation was about 23.12%, and it was largely driven by by high cost of tuber and high cost of wheat or bread. So, like I said earlier, the central bank has increased interest rates across the board by increasing the MPR to 15.5%. But that is even not the bigger story. The big story is even that the cash reserve ratio was increased to 13.5%. And if you remember that liquidity ratio is still 30%. So for the bank that have mobilized money, they have to keep 62.5% of the amount they mobilize in liquid form, either with central bank, which does not earn them income, or in liquid assets which they are not going to lend. So the bank is left with lending only 37.5% of the amount they mobilize as deposits. And for that reason, they have to cover the cost of lending only 32.5%, 7.5% of the total deposit from the cost of the entire deposit mobilization from just lending 37.5% of it, which means they had to increase their rate. And I know a bank like Zenith Bank has already announced, and Zenith Bank is a market leader, has already announced that their minimum lending rate is now 25%. What are the implications of this? The implication of this is that because there's no consumer credit, so it wouldn't affect you and I. We only buy food with our salaries. If we don't have enough salary to buy food, we go hungry. So, but it will affect the manufacturing sector who borrows from the banks to produce. And because they have a longer access of conversion cycle, for the benefit of those who are not economists, access conversion cycle is the time it takes you from the time you buy raw materials and the time you sell the goods and get back cash. By the time you use your cash to go and buy raw materials and the time you finish producing, sell the goods and get cash. So because they have a long asset conversion cycle, their interest cost is always higher. And that means that their cost of production will increase. And as the cost of production is increasing, when consumers do not have increase in their earnings, the volume of the goods that we demanded will also reduce. So when volume of goods demanded will reduces, their level of production they have to cut down their production and then cut down employment. And those are the risks we now face, that the current policies could likely push the global, the Nigerian economy into a downward trend or into a negative territory. We saw the impact of the increase in rate on the US employment rates. So we should expect that unemployment will worsen, GDP productivity will decline, and GDP will, at the minimum, the growth rate will decline below what it was, which I had said earlier at the beginning of our conversation. Then many of us are fully aware that the country is now highly geared or highly leveraged. If you look at the fact that in the past 7 years, the country's national stock, debt stock, has increased by as high as if you look at that the past, I think I missed out that segment. Okay, good. We had an increase of 1.25 trillion naira in the debt stock in Q2 2022 to 42.85 trillion naira. The standard debt stock is about 16.62 trillion naira, about $40 billion, whereas domestic debt is about 26.23 trillion naira, or about $63.25 billion. The debt service in the has risen to about 668.7 billion naira in the second quarter of this year. And it's expected that Nigeria will spend 110% of its revenue to service debt, which means we will spend the entire money we are going to generate to service debt and borrow another 10% to complement what we have already generated to pay for debt. So that shows you how precarious our fiscal condition is. Interestingly, I think this is just to give you an idea of how much resources have been mobilized in the recent past and how much we have spent as a country. The Nigerian budget deficit for the past 7 years of the current government is about 30.58 trillion naira. The current administration has spent about 54.5 98 trillion naira as budgeted implementation and only generated revenue about 24.939 trillion naira, leaving a deficit of 30.58 trillion. I'm sure you would have heard when they announced that they are borrowing from the central bank by the current government is about 20 trillion naira. That our ways and means borrowing is about 20 trillion naira, which they said they now want to securitize. Interestingly, in the federal government with the president will present the 2023 budget to the National Assembly on Friday, October 14th. No, it's actually October 7th, sorry. Next tomorrow, it's October 7th. And the budget deficit projected in that budget that the federal government, this president will present is 11.3 trillion naira. The government is budgeting that they will spend 19.76 trillion naira in next year's fiscal year, and then they will only generate 8.46 trillion naira, leaving a budget deficit of 11.3 trillion naira. And we know that the government has never had the history of meeting its revenue projections. So even the 8.46 trillion naira is very optimistic. So if we go by this budgeted expenditure, then we may end up, I think even the minister said the budget deficit could get as high as 12.4 trillion naira next year. Now to the capital market. Of course, we saw a market that rallied in the first half of the year, but subsequently, as a result of tightening of policy rates, we know that the Monetary Policy Committee tightened rate twice in the third quarter of this year. We saw an increase from 13% to 14% in July, and then another increase from 14% to 15.5% in September. All these things had negative impact on the stock market. So as at year to date, as at the end of September, the market had gained 14.7%, 14.7% or 77%. But market capitalization has increased by 18.9% because of new listings. So, what we saw was a market that declined in the last quarter, second quarter, third quarter of this year, as a result of policy changes that impacted negatively on the market. Some of the policy changes we have spoken extensively about, increase in monetary policy. That of course we know as economic managers, even as households, that when interest rates increase, people will now move their money to go and invest in fixed income instruments instead of buying equities. So this will show you the market capitalization of the NGS 30 and the profit level of the NGS 30. You can see that the most capitalized stock is Airtel, but the most profitable company is MTN. Dangote is the third most capitalized stock, but also the second most most profitable company. Look at Zenith as third most profitable company, but look at their capitalization; they are actually among the top 8. So if you look at that, you will realize that Zenith is somewhere there around the 8th most capitalized company. So these are the indication of whether a company is overvalued or undervalued, and what kind of value you will get if you invest in those stocks. So we expect the market industry to benefit from the increase in interest rate. I mentioned earlier that Zenith Bank has increased its minimum lending rate or prime lending rate, as they call it, to 25%. What that means that they will rake in more revenue from lending. But what goes with such high interest rate that you're going to see an uptick in cost of lending, which is what they call non-performing loans. You're going to see that spike. So as they are trying to make more money from lending, they should also watch the quality of their credits. So our top pick is ETI, Fidelity, and Stanbic IBTC. The telecommunication sector is going to be one of the beneficiaries of the current political environment. We've seen people sharing videos, sharing rallies, sharing matches. All those things are consuming data. And my wife asked me the other day, I think on Sunday, how come her data had just finished? And I said, but you've been watching all the matches that took place on Saturday. or the carnival-like matches across the country for the Labour Party presidential candidate. And that those things we are making demands on your data. But that's exactly what will happen to so many people. We're going to spend so much money on data because at the minimum, those watching those things give us some relief. So in effect, you're going to see operators in that sector, telco companies, MTN and Airtel be beneficiaries of that. Added to that, they've also developed, the two of them have also developed secondary income or alternative income by getting their payment service banking licenses. So you should expect that markets will favor their performance. We should expect increase in their revenues from their core business of data services and voice services to their payment service banking business. So our topic there is MTN. The industrial goods sector, we expect that a few government that still having little resource who want to do some symbolic construction, road constructions as the election is approaching, as what they call dividend of democracy, to woo investors to vote them in again, particularly those governments that are in power. So we expect that they should have some level of demand for cement and other industrial goods items. Though we don't think that will be very pronounced, because we know, like I said, presented here, the government is in severe need of funding and they don't have the access to so much of fund. So, and then private sector developers, particularly those industrial, are likely going to slow down in the next couple of months. But all the same, if there's any two companies that will benefit from any uptick in demand for industrial goods, our topic is Dangote Cement and Lafarge. Oil and gas sector. The performance of the oil and gas sector has been one of the most stunning in Nigeria's buzz this year, driven largely by Seplat. Of course, Seplat benefited fully from the Russian-Ukraine war as our crude prices went up and gas prices went up. So, and that has defined what has happened in that sector. So we think, like I said earlier, that with Russia annexing 4 oblasts in Ukraine, the war is not like about to end. So we think the operator in that sector will still continue to benefit. So our top pick are Seplat and Total Energia. Then consumer goods sector. We think what happens in an election period that a lot of handouts, cash handouts are given to a campaign officials, including people who used to be jobless, they've been invited, boss to some locations and by some parties, and then they will be paid, thank you for coming. So normally that will increase their demand for basic food items. So we think operators in that sector that provide basic food items will benefit. Those in beverages, those in other consumer goods items will benefit, particularly those in the brewery industry. We know that after a campaign season, people that went on campaign, most of them will hit the bottom. So we think we're going to see an uptick in demand for people in the brewery industry. So our top pick are Dangote Sugar and Guinness. The European market, we've seen, I'm gradually winding down. We've seen, because of the increase in interest rates, and I mentioned this earlier, we saw a flight to safety of investors moving away from emerging economies and selling down on dumping emerging economy assets and moving to the US. So we've seen a major decline in the price of emerging market Eurobonds and uptick in their yield. To the extent that we have an average yield for most emerging market Eurobonds at about 14.5%. The likes of Ghana is trading about 30% or thereabouts. Some other countries are going through and now classified as fully a junk bond. And we had mentioned earlier that some of them are actually at the risk of defaulting on their interest payment or principal repayment for their Eurobond. So we've seen major dumping of emerging market Eurobond. But like Warren Buffett said, it's when everybody's afraid that you should be courageous. So we strongly recommend for those who have access to dollar inflow to take positions in these Eurobonds, particularly those countries' Eurobonds where there is likelihood, there's less likelihood of a default. The likes of Angola, that's making a lot of money from sale of crude, is likely going to be minimal risk of defaults. So for such investments, you could get very good return on your investment, and you could actually also be hedging against further currency depreciation. The local bonds, I've talked about when you have an increase in interest rate, you're going to see investors switch from fixed equity market, equity instrument to fixed income instrument. We expect that to continue. I've already talked about the fact that the market saw a slowdown in the third quarter of this year. So we think the market will remain relatively bearish in the remaining part of this year if the current policy environment is maintained. As we move towards an election period, it's not time when we go on speculative investment. It's also with the current interest rate environment, investors will now begin to switch their investments to fixed income instruments. We saw yield, the marginal rate for 364-day bills in the last auction was about 12%, up from about 9.75%. And that trend has continued apart from the blip we had about a week ago when it dropped from 10% to 9.75%. But with an increase from 9.75% to about 12%, it's an indication of the direction the central bank wants to go. Hopefully, they may want to match at the minimum inflation rate in terms of yield on fixed income treasury bills. So on that note, I will invite questions and answers. I know there are already some questions on the question box, so Oloju will read them out and I will take them.
Thank you very much, sir. I'll just dive right into the questions. Okay, how do you think the federal government will fund its deficit this year? Are they likely to resort to central bank funding again? What is the long-term implication of debt service exceeding revenues? Where do you see the Naira and domestic yields closing by the end of the year?
Okay, the federal government unfortunately has very limited headroom to fund its budget other than going to central bank and borrowing locally. As it stands today, the federal government will not approach the Eurobond market because yield, the price that they have to sell those instruments will be very exorbitant, and we can't afford to borrow at such elevated price cost. So the federal government will likely borrow by ways and means. So you're going to fund partly from the central bank ways and means, and partly by borrowing from the local bond market. So we should expect the government will be very active in the local bond market next year to fund the budget. I also think that because there will going to be a change in government, part of the 19.76 trillion naira the government had projected to spend, a new government will likely come up with a revised budget, possibly eliminate subsidy and cut down on that expenditure.
Okay, OPEC has scheduled to hold a physical meeting today. Do you see crude price going up after the meeting? And also, what's your view or advice in respect of the Japa syndrome? Will it affect the Nigerian economy?
Okay, on OPEC meeting, I had actually mentioned that OPEC and OPEC Plus are, okay, maybe I didn't mention that they are scheduled to have a meeting, that the meeting that happened today, as of 2 days ago, they were planning to cut crude production by about 1 million barrels. As of yesterday, discussions among them ahead of the meeting today is that they're going to cut crude production by about 2 million barrels. Of course, Saudi Arabia is driving this initiative to cut crude production by about 2 million barrels, which is actually against the interest of the US. The US has been putting pressure on Saudi to increase crude production. But Saudi wants to maximize the benefits of this crisis. And Saudi, being the major driver of OPEC, will likely get the concurrence of members to cut crude production by about 2 million barrels, which will mean that crude prices will move up again. I had mentioned earlier that as of this morning, crude price had moved again from $88, it was yesterday, to about $90 as of this morning. I guess it may have traded up further, because what happens is that speculators and traders will want to take position immediately, knowing fully where that crude price will go up. So then on the Japa syndrome, certainly is affecting the quality of output in the country. A lot of skilled Nigerians have left the country to go and work elsewhere. And sometimes you can't even get the skills that you need for employment purposes. So it's going to affect the level of quality of output in the country, productivity of the local economy. But it's not all, there's actually there's no country in the world, there's no place in the world where it's a bed of roses. So even for those who are going to those countries, I had mentioned that in England, the cost of energy is so high, the cost of natural gas is so expensive in Germany, they're hurting. So you also realize that unless you are good income in some of the Western countries people are going to, you will also be hurting when you get there. And you don't have the safety nets of your family and friends that we have here. And again, it's our projection is that come next year after the election, we should begin to see reversal of policies that will lead to a restoration of growth in the economy. Roger, you can go ahead. Roger, are you there? Can anybody hear me so that I can read out the questions and continue once she comes back?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, there's a question from that. How do you think the federal government will fund its deficit? Okay, I think I've answered that. That was the first question. Next question should be, why is Nigeria not benefiting from the global oil prices increase? We have always benefited. Why this poor earnings position? The simple reason that our crude production had declined precipitously. 10 years ago, our crude production about 2.4 million barrels, 2.4 million barrels a day. At some point, the target was we should be producing about 4 million barrels, 3 million barrels a day. Now, I had mentioned in this presentation that as of August, we only produced 972,000 barrels a day. We used to be the largest producer of crude in Africa. Even as we speak now, Angola is producing higher than us, and even Libya is producing more volume than us. And Ghana was producing about 1.18 million barrels. I think Libya was producing about 1.112 million barrels a day, while Nigeria produced 972 million barrels a day. Thousand, not million. 972,000 barrels a day compared to what. So that's why we're not benefiting from it. There is a lot of shorting. Of course, the federal government, the NNP said they have restored the transatlantic pipeline that carries about 400,000 barrels of crude a day, and the crude production will go up. We're hoping that will be maintained, because what is happening is that most crude producers are complaining that their level of reconciliation is just less than 20%. What that means is that when they pump in crude into the pipeline that they produce, when they produce crude and pump into the pipeline, when they get to the export terminal, they only get about 20% of what they have pumped in. The rest is stolen. One particular company said to me yesterday they've shut down their production because there's no point. They're getting 5% reconciliation. They pump in 20,000 barrels and they get like 2,500 barrels at the end of the pipeline. So that they have to shut down. How can we change the narrative? I think changing the narrative, what's happening to us is not a natural thing. It's not nature. It's not providence, not what prayers will do for us. It's something we have to do for ourselves. We need to get the leadership right. Every country, every society, every organization is defined by the quality of leadership it has. Once you get the leadership right, you get it right. I had mentioned in this presentation that Britain elected Elizabeth Truss as the Prime Minister just about 2 weeks ago or thereabouts. And then her first policy announcement was to cut down on taxes by about $45 billion pounds. And the impact was pounds dropped to $1.02 per pound, the lowest in the history of the world. And the whole pounds came under attack, and the British economy was almost went up in flames. So you had to reverse herself. That simply meant, and that's exactly what took Margaret Thatcher out. It was an attack on pounds that when she made a wrong judgment, that George Soros took out the pounds, and that led to the failure of Margaret Thatcher's government. So it's actually being speculated that Elizabeth Truss government will pack up in the next few days because of wrong judgment. But that's how good systems work. We must have a system, political system, that will elect the right people, and where they fail, we send them back in. The next question, Trojan, when you're back, please let me know. Trojan, when you're back, please. Aya, maybe you should read out the question so I can continue answering, since you are still in the meeting. Ayo.
No, I think Roger is back, sir.
Okay. So Roger, can you take the questions? I'm on Victor Mote.
Okay, sorry for the network disruptions. I'll just go right into it. Okay, what impact will increased spending by political parties in carrying out their campaigns have on
Well, the impact will be the.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Also, if government desired not to increase interest, what options do you think can be used to edge ever rising interest rates?
Okay, the first question, the impact is that we're going to see increase in liquidity in the country. So you're going to see increase in some consumer spending and basic necessities of life. People will buy more of beverages, people will buy more food, people will buy more basic clothing, more basic wares, because the kind of money that will come into the hands of the artisans are such that they will just basically need to meet basic needs. You're going to see increase in demand for things like keke napep, and then bicycle, other tricycle, things like motorbikes that are given as a handout to political talks and politically exposed operators. So, but ultimately, the economy will see an increase in consumer demand, which means the likes of Nestle, the likes of Cadbury will benefit from it. You're going to see increase in demand for tailoring services, people making t-shirts, face caps. You're going to see increase in textiles. You're going to see increase in itinerary workers like musicians, entertainers, jesters. They will not get some increase in their demand. They will also see increase in demand for fuel as more of these buses are hired and the people are bussed around the country. So those are the impacts, a general impact. On if the government desired not to increase interest rate, what options do you think can be used to hedge ever rising interest rates? As it stands today, the key thing to inflation, I believe, want to say ever rising inflation rates. What you need to use to fight inflation is increased productivity. The inflation pressure we're witnessing today is driven by lack of or supply shortfall, because we're not producing enough food. We're not, we don't have enough foreign exchange earnings. But let's start from the food. If you produce enough food, the price of food items will drop. So the current inflationary pressure, it has to be fought by focusing on those factors driving it. It is not interest rate that is driving inflation. It's not because people are borrowing money from the banks are using it to buy goods and services. It's because you can't get the food. Tomato price has gone up because they are not getting enough tomato. Potato has gone up because they are not getting enough potato. And because other factor is that you're having a pass-through effect of depreciation of local currency. If we are producing enough crude, our currency will be stable, and then whatever we import to the country will be at a lower cost, and then the pass-through effect will not be there. So those are the ways to fight it. Improve food production by fighting insecurity in the northern part of the country. Excuse me. Then improve your foreign exchange earnings by restoring crude production, and then you'll find your inflation rate will moderate. Okay, Reggie, go ahead.
Based on the current happenings around the world, and what advice do you have for investors on where to position in such a situation? Should the investors position in equities or fixed income?
If the current trend in central banks tightening liquidity continues, what they will end up doing is they push, like I said, what has happened in America, and we're going to see a slowdown in America. They're going to push the world economy into a recession. What do you do? But like I said, the warnings are beginning. I've been warning and screaming for the past 6 months on this. I said the tendency, we need to address the supply bottleneck and not necessarily to increase interest rates. I'm happy that the likes of United Nations and World Bank have joined in those warnings. Hopefully, the US, they are determined to make sure they bring down inflation rates. So hopefully, at some point, the World Central Bank will realize that the emphasis should be on how to increase those input materials or input items that are causing the pressure. Then how do you hedge against rising interest rates? You have to stay in the short end of the market. So if you have deposits, you place it with us or play with any bank for shorter tenors, 90 days, 60 days, 120 days, so that when rates go up, you have the benefit of repricing your interest rates, because rates are going to go up. So you shouldn't go long term. You should stay in the short end of the market, placing your money and loading it over time. Roger, I'm waiting.
Okay, I think Roger is currently off right now. But I will pick maybe one or two questions from my end. Okay, so we have a question from Chukwuemeka Henry that says, with the CBN's policy on bank sorting of dollars, what are your takes and forecasts for Naira?
You have jumped so many people.
Oh yes, where mine starts from is a bit different. That's why.
Okay, I'll answer that and go back to, if you scroll back, you should be able to see the other questions. It says, with the CBN policy on bank sorting for dollar, what are your takes and forecasts for the Naira? I think Naira will continue to be under pressure as long as we don't earn more foreign exchange. The central bank has been managing the payment of dollar obligations that the country owns. Like what happened when the airlines, foreign airlines insisted that they are going to stop flying. So you're going to see that level of blackmail or threat by others who should have their money paid to them. So when that happens, you're going to see further decline in reserve unless we improve on crude production and begin to earn more foreign exchange. So that's, there's no two ways about it. We're basically holding the post money and saying we have money. Then I'll take the one from Tochukwu. Say, do you foresee global recession based on, I think I've taken that, based on happening around the world and what advice here. Okay, there's Yahya Yusuf. The CBN increased interest rates mainly to fight the high rates of inflation. Had it been the CBN decided to rather decrease interest rate to 9%, what would have been the effect? Interestingly, in the case of Nigeria, we don't have the transmission channel. There's a complete disconnect between monetary policy rates and inflation rate in the country. Because like I said, we don't have a consumer credit, so people don't borrow to go and buy goods and services. It's when you have consumer credit that interest rate serves as a channel or transmission channel to reduce inflation rates. So if they had reduced that, what would have happened was those in the manufacturing sector, the sector would have been borrowing at lower cost because the banks will not be able to increase their lending rates at the minimum. So they would have been able to borrow at lower cost, and then production will continue to go up. If you look at the GDP figure for the second quarter, the manufacturing sector grew by 3% in the second quarter of this year. And manufacturing sector accounts for more than 8%, about 8.6% of the GDP. So those are the sectors that I'm sure you know that MTN has gone to the market to borrow. So they are borrowing at high rates will also mean that their cost will also increase. So a lower interest rate, their countries have taken that route. The country like Turkey is insisting that despite inflation at more than 80%, they are not going to increase rate. They are actually reducing rate because they say they want to sustain productive activities.
Okay, so I think we should take maybe 3 more questions and wrap up the session. So after Yahya Yusuf's question, we have an anonymous question here that says, do you think the actions by the monetary policy team will be enough to decelerate inflationary pressure for the time being? I think you answered something along that line. Okay, we have another anonymous here, but that's the person is asking if you do fixed income from.
Yes, we do. We do. We can help you buy Angolan Eurobond if you want to invest in Angola and Eurobond. And like I said, Angola has shown one of those countries badly managed as African country, but they've gotten it right with their oil and gas production, and they're enjoying the benefit of it. So if you want that, you can reach out to us, and we'll help you invest in it.
Okay, sir. So I think we'll take the last question from Oladimeji, which says, what is the outlook for the insurance industry in 2023?
Well, the insurance industry in 2023 will likely remain what I call silent because the industry has to do some heavy lifting that will transform that sector. The issue of capitalization of the industry has not been addressed. It has been in the offing for quite some time. Nikon has come up with a risk-based capital base, which they had to suspend at some point, and then wanted to do across the board capitalization for different categories of insurance companies, life insurance, composite insurance, and general. But that was also suspended because courts, some people went to court and stopped that. Those are factors that are critical for the insurance industry to be positioned in as it should be in the country. So until those things are done, the industry will remain largely lukewarm in the environment, or largely uneventful. I think that's the right word, largely uneventful in the coming year.
Ayo.
Yes,
let the GMD also answer the question on NNPC acquisition.
Okay, no problem. So, okay, we'll entertain that last question. Okay, so we have a question from Farouk here that says, sir, can you please shed light on NNPC acquisition of Wando retail filling stations? And is this a good strategic diversification for NNPC?
Okay, I recall that I attended the unveiling of NNPC new logo at the State House in Abuja, and one of the hallmark of the presentation by the GM of NNPC is that they need to do about 500 retail stations. So what they have done by acquiring Wando retail stations is to adopt an inorganic growth to achieve their strategic objective. So it's in their strategic objective, they want to be a major player in the downstream sector of the oil and gas industry. And as you recall, they declared a profit of about 674 billion naira for last financial year. So it's a proper fit for NNPC Limited, or NNPC PS as it will soon be called. But the key thing is that remember, they have also been divested the regulatory role. They are now an operator, just like Saudi Aramco is an operator. Of course, Saudi Aramco profit cannot be compared with our own, because the first quarter of this year they made about 30 billion naira in profit, but we made just barely. Maybe if you use even a 700 naira to a dollar, they made about maybe 900 million naira profit in the full half of last year. But it's a proper fit for their own strategic objective of being a major downstream, a major integrated oil and gas company, because they are playing in the upstream segment through MPDC. They are playing in downstream segment through NNPC retail.
Okay, sir. I know we've said that is the last question, but we're going to play it. Take one last one again, sir, and we call it a day. So this is from Kevin Okoro, which says, based on this analysis and from an ROI perspective, what would be your recommended expert investment advice on the below options: real estate, financial instruments, trading, and manufacturing?
Interestingly, the real estate sector has actually outperformed the inflation in the country and also outperformed every other sector. If you look at the yield, the return on sectorial basis, the real estate sector is the only one that is turning positive, adjusted for inflation. But you also know that real estate does not have liquidity, and the asset conversion cycle could be long. So if you have the resources to play in real estate, By the time you start construction, maybe before you finish, the election would have come and gone, and then you'll be in a position to sell. But it's in terms of return on investment, real estate is number one, followed by trading, followed by financial institutions, and followed by manufacturing.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are going to call it a day here. And once again, thank you for this fantastic session and touching on every aspect that, as usual, we expect you to have touched on. And we are all definitely, I'm sure everybody must have enjoyed the session, and we are definitely looking forward to the last quarter review, which definitely will be a very interesting one. I would be introducing to give the vote of thanks our Senior Vice President of Wholesale Banking, Mr. Okudiliegu, to come and give a vote of thanks for this session. You're welcome, sir.
Okay, thank you everyone for finding time to participate in this webinar. We spent an hour 45 minutes, and it was quite worth the while. So we promise you that at Carrier Assets, we'll keep bringing up knowledge-based analysis to help you as investors and entrepreneurs make informed decisions. So like Ayo have mentioned, please tune in again in 3 months' time when we take our 4-quarter review, and we promise that we will not disappoint. Thank you so much for your time, and may God bless you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
Thanks.
and this is just to also for everyone that has joined the session, we will be sending the presentation slides immediately after the session, and also the link to the session for those that want to rewatch the presentation, and we'll all get attachments of this presentation that just concluded. Thank you very much once again, and hopefully we'll see you at the next the last quarter review. Have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.